Centuries ago, an old father, as old as one of them, lay on his couch feeling that his end was near. He was not surprised. In fact, he had foreseen it as he had foreseen many other events. And he was reputed wise beyond his years, and therefore far beyond those of the people who reputed it. So he called softly to him his 3 sons. They didn't hear him, being busy in different parts of the house, and it never occurred to him to ring the bell, because he was so old-fangled. He shouted to them, and they came.
"I have 3 things to say to you," remarked the father solemnly.
The sons fidgeted visibly. They had been studying, were not at home to anyone, and particularly had not wished to be disturbed in their work. They thought that their father was going to begin another anecdote, and it put them out of humor. But they were startled when he said, "My sons, my end is near." Each one replied with an endearing term, just one, for they were not men of many words, and they told him it was only his fuss, that he was only 100 and didn't look as if he were going to be cut off prematurely, that he mustn't give in and should never say die.
"I cannot argue the point," replied the old man. "Let me tell you my last wishes as briefly as I can, for my time is short."
They tried to dissuade him from talking so much, but it was of no avail, for he protested that it was their duty to listen to him, and he insisted upon having last wishes, as he had read that others had had before him, and it would be for the sons to obey and unravel them as best they could. Then the father, addressing the eldest, who was ambitious and already past middle age, spoke as follows.
"My son, my firstborn, find out the furthermost summit of the world, and when you have surmounted that, you can surmount anything."
To his second son, who was avaricious and also getting old and rather bald, he said, "Sit patiently and wait, and when you can hear a voice that comes from no living throat and can see its traces, you will want for nothing." To the third son, and consequently his favorite, who was romantic, being better looking and naturally younger than his elder brothers, the father spoke thus.
"You, my son, who are the pride of my heart, the joy of my life, the light of mine eyes, search the atmosphere till at your bidding it showers down burning stars. Then shall you go to the beautiful princess who awaits you, and live without labor."
And the 3 brothers murmured under their breath, "Poor old Dad, he's certainly very unwell." But he had not yet finished.
"Try to realize your ambition, my sons," he continued. "I have shown you the ways you should go. Then, and only then, will you have earned that priceless jewel, contentment."
The old man then composed himself comfortably and died a few years later, after a sharp attack of senile decay, leaving many regrets and unsettled accounts behind him. When that happened, the 3 sons were very sad all day and all night. The very next morning they called to mind his last wishes of a few years ago, and decided to ponder over them, give them the benefit of their doubt, and see if anything could be made out of them. And they stuck manfully to their resolution, especially as the creditors were hourly expected. The eldest son looked up all the maps and geography books he could get hold of, and studied them until he came to the uncomfortable conclusion that he would certainly risk death by sea and cannibals many times before he could hope to reach the furthermost summit of the globe. And the second-born said, If I were to fondle a pin and said, "Ah, pin, canst thou help me in my distress?" 10 to 1 I would get pricked and serve me right for being so imbecile.
As for me, exclaimed the romantic one, were a gentle wolf to find me mooning about the forest, thinking of my beauteous princess, surely would he stop and, with a keen sense of the fitness of things, he would not trifle with politeness, but he would eat of me as much as would satisfy his present need, perhaps even more than he could digest.
And the brothers laughed aloud in the splenetic bitterness of their 3 souls. Another year went by. The sons had paid their father's debts and made some on their own account, so they held a council, and they confessed that they had idled so long because they were haunted by the rosy promise their father's words held out. And do what they would, they could neither forget them nor yet find any solution. Then together they pondered and thought, until one fine day, all the rest about that time had been wet, they concluded that as they were not believers in fairy tales, science perhaps might help them. So they worked and worked and worked, each with his own object. They certainly did not lack brains, or test tubes, or electric wire, yet just as certainly did they lack money. And but for the occasional doing of menial work, they would have starved and starved, and gone hungry. At last the eldest son solved his mystery. Now could he surmount the furthest summit of the world, for he had invented a machine which could carry him soaring like a bird over mountains and over seas. And the second son solved his mystery. Now he could hear a voice that came from no living throat, and yet could see its traces, for he had invented an automaton that could speak and could record its words with a stylus upon tablets of wax. And the third son solved his mystery. He had searched the atmosphere, and now at his bidding burning stars were showered down, for he had invented a kite fashioned on a wonderful wire, which went through the air and drew forth electric sparks, and his heart burned with love for the beautiful princess whom he knew awaited him, though by this time she must be getting on. The excitement of the brothers was great. "It is our genius we can thank," they exclaimed all in 3 breaths. "Our father, steeped in his old-fangled lore, never could have foreseen our triumphs. He never could have guessed how we should solve his posers." That was their conclusion. Then they shook hands all round, congratulated one another, and went their different ways. The eldest flew off, mounted upon his wonderful air-steed, amid the gaping of the astonished villagers, and his 2 brothers looked after him wistfully until he disappeared far away behind the clouds. The hopes of the traveler rose ever higher and higher as for weeks and months he soared on, exhilarated beyond all imagination. At last he came to the furthermost summit of which his dear father had spoken so solemnly. This disappointing ending to so much effort and such real success encouraged him in the conviction that in the position in which he found himself, he could find no legitimate ground for contentment. During this time, the favorite son had sallied forth, singing in search of the beauteous princess. His marvelous kite was slung behind him. He wended his steps towards the only court he knew of, where dwelt a princess good, beautiful, and unmarried, a combination of charms of marked rarity. So joyous and merry was he that the squirrels squeaked and scurried away at sight of him, and the very hyenas laughed in harmony as he passed by, singing "Tra-la-la" in his blithe lightsomeness. Now the princess sat in the vast hall of the palace, turning up her nose at the stream of suitors that promenaded in front of her, very bored and weary at the continuous routine. But she never seemed to tire of it in her certainty that the right one would put in his appearance at the right moment. She was a very spoiled lady indeed. There was no one to gainsay her. Indeed, so spoiled was she that every night she would cry for the stars and blame the skies for being selfish and not sparing her a few when they knew, for she had often told them, that she wished to wear them in her hair. And everyone said how illogical it was of her, and no one told her they were too large for practical purposes. He was so intoxicated with delight that afterwards he could never quite tell how it all came about. As in a haze, he remembered the princess greeting him as the one long awaited. He recollected her saying that as he could wrest the stars from the selfish skies, he could gratify her desire to wear some in her hair, and bade him go collect them. He explained his invention. She grew impatient. He told her the electricity would kill him. She shrugged her shoulders and insisted. He declined to take the risk. Whereupon she turned into a fury in her pretty illogicality, and exclaiming that he must be the wrong man after all, she flung his invention into the fire and ordered him to be flung after it. He took the hint by the heels and fled through the window, far into the night. So, in order not to trespass for fear of prosecution, they all three sat down a little outside the boundary line and recounted each to the others their adventures and their experiences. It was nightfall before they had done, and they really could hardly help laughing. And then, after thinking things out, they shook hands all round in silence. For the prophecy had come true. They were content. The three sons were now thoroughly content, to work no more, to do nothing more for the rest of their existence. It wasn't worth it, they said. Their disappointments were over, and they were fully content that they should be so. The villagers, once more open-mouthed in their gaping, and open-minded too, differed from the inhabitants of the great city, and looked upon the brothers as who should say, 3 wise men, and took upon themselves the care of them in the workhouse, and were proud to get them and to show them to visitors. As to the beautiful princess, she was changed by time into an old maid, and still kept on turning up her nose at elderly, rheumatic suitors as they passed on their usual rounds. So the old father was right after all. His ambitious son had surmounted everything, including disappointment. His avaricious son had succeeded in having his wants supplied for nothing, and his favorite son could jog along as romantically as the workhouse rules allowed, without labor and without effort.